A man spent 2 years living in a cabin he built himself, and we've been arguing about what it means ever since. Not whether he did it, but why. Not what happened there, but what we're supposed to learn from it. Henry David Thoreau walked into the woods in 1845 and somehow never left our collective imagination. But here's what nobody tells you about Thoreau, the guy everyone pictures as a reclusive hermit communing with nature. He lived less than 2 miles from town, the radical who rejected society. His mum did his laundry, the man who supposedly cut himself off from civilization. He had dinner parties at the cabin and walked into Concord almost daily. Everything you think you know about Thoreau is partially true and completely misleading. He's been turned into a symbol, a meme, a vague idea about simplicity and nature. Meanwhile, the actual person, the complicated, contradictory, brilliant, and sometimes insufferable human being, has disappeared behind the legend. That's the story worth telling. Not the myth of the hermit sage, but the reality of someone trying to figure out how to live in a world that didn't make sense to him. July 12, 1817. Concord, Massachusetts. A third child arrives in a family that's already struggling. They name him David Henry Thoreau, after an uncle who'd recently died. Years later, he'll flip the names around because everyone calls him Henry anyway, but he never bothers making it legal. That detail tells you something. He cared about some conventions and ignored others based on criteria that made sense only to him. His father, John Thoreau, ran a pencil factory. Ran is generous, operated is more accurate. The business existed, produced pencils, generated barely enough income to keep the family afloat. John Thoreau was what people charitably call a small businessman and uncharitably call unsuccessful. He moved the family constantly, chasing better prospects. Concord to Chelmsford, back to Concord. Boston, back to Concord again. By the time Henry was 6, he'd lived in 4 different places. His mother, Cynthia Dunbar Thoreau, was the opposite. Energetic, practical, bustling. She took in boarders to make ends meet. While John tinkered with pencil production, Cynthia ran the household, managed the finances, and generally kept everything from falling apart. Their home was constantly full of strangers, paying for rooms and meals. Privacy was a luxury the Thoreaus couldn't afford. Henry was a weird kid. Not troubled, just odd. Serious, grave. Adults joked that he seemed like a tiny judge, always observing, always thinking. His older brother John was the fun one, popular with other kids, easy with people. Henry was the one who sat quietly watching, absorbing, filing away observations he'd used decades later. The family settled permanently in Concord in 1823, when Henry was 6. This would be the place that defined him, though he'd spend much of his life trying to define his relationship to it. Small town, about 2,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and that familiarity breeds both comfort and suffocation. In 1828, Henry and John Jr. enrolled at Concord Academy. Progressive for its time, which meant it didn't beat knowledge into students quite as enthusiastically as other schools. Henry thrived there. Not socially. He never thrived socially, but intellectually. He was good at school in that specific way that makes you suspect education is the thing you're designed for, even if you're not sure what you're supposed to do with it afterward. His family recognized this. Despite their limited means, despite John Sr.'s suggestion that maybe Henry should learn carpentry or cabinet making, something practical, Cynthia insisted he go to Harvard. This wasn't a casual decision. Harvard cost money they didn't have. Tuition was $55 a year. With books and room and board, the total came to $179. For context, that was more than many families earned in a year. The entire family contributed. Siblings, aunts, everyone pitched in to send Henry to college. He took the entrance exams in summer 1833. Barely passed. That's important. This wasn't a prodigy breezing through. This was a smart kid from a struggling family scraping by on collective sacrifice. Harvard in the 1830s was not what you're imagining. It wasn't the intellectual powerhouse it would become. It was a finishing school for rich boys, and a few scholarship students, like Thoreau, who didn't quite fit. The curriculum was rigid, classical, designed to produce gentlemen rather than thinkers. Latin, Greek, mathematics, rhetoric. You memorized, you recited, you demonstrated that you'd absorbed the approved texts. Thoreau did fine. Not brilliant, not struggling. Top half of his class when he graduated in 1837. But something more important than grades happened at Harvard. He started reading beyond the curriculum. He discovered authors who saw the world differently. He encountered ideas that suggested maybe the way everyone lived wasn't the only option. And in 1837, he met Ralph Waldo Emerson, or rather, he encountered Emerson's ideas. Nature had just been published, and it was electrifying the small circle of intellectuals in New England. Emerson argued that direct experience of the natural world could reveal truths that institutions and traditions obscured, that you didn't need intermediaries, priests or professors, between yourself and reality. That authentic living required stripping away convention and connecting with something fundamental. For a 20-year-old who'd always felt slightly out of step with normal life, this was permission. Validation that the discomfort wasn't a flaw, but potentially a strength. But first, he had to figure out how to make a living. It's 1837. The economy is in a depression. Jobs are scarce. Thoreau has a Harvard degree and no clear path forward. He takes a teaching position at Concord Center School. It lasts 2 weeks. The school required teachers to use corporal punishment. Beating students was standard practice, considered necessary for discipline. Thoreau refused. When the school committee insisted, he administered a few token whippings to random students to demonstrate how absurd the policy was, then quit. This is classic Thoreau. Principles over practicality, but in a way that's both admirable and frustrating. He didn't just refuse quietly. He made a point, alienated the people who'd hired him, and left himself unemployed on principle. So he and his brother John decided to start their own school. The Thoreau Academy opened in 1838, operating on radically different principles. No corporal punishment, hands-on learning, field trips to local businesses to see how things actually worked. Students went to the newspaper office, the gunsmith, the various workshops around Concord. They took walks in the woods where Henry would point out plants and animals and geological features. It was progressive education before that term existed, the kind of teaching that emphasized understanding over memorization, curiosity over obedience. And it worked. The school attracted students, gained a reputation. For 3 years, the brothers ran a successful experiment in alternative education. Then Ellen Sewall arrived. She was visiting Concord from Cape Cod, and both brothers fell for her. This is where the story gets messy, in that particularly human way that complicates clean narratives. John proposed to Ellen first. She turned him down. Then Henry proposed. She accepted, briefly. Then her father intervened. The Sewall family had heard about the Thoreau's religious views. Too liberal, too transcendental, too much questioning of traditional Christianity. Ellen's father forbade the marriage, and she complied. Henry would tell his sister, Sophia, years later, on his deathbed, that he never got over Ellen. That admission hangs there. The man who would write about self-reliance and living deliberately carried this particular wound his entire life. The school continued for a while, but in 1841, John Jr.'s health began failing. Tuberculosis was suspected. They closed the academy. Henry needed work again. This time, Emerson offered a solution. Come live with us. Help with household tasks, yard work, whatever needs doing. In exchange, room, board, and access to Emerson's extensive library. Thoreau moved into the Emerson household in 1841. He was 24. Emerson was 14 years older, wealthy, established, connected. The relationship was mentor and protege, but also more complicated. Emerson saw potential in Thoreau. but also something that made him uncomfortable. Thoreau's radicalism went further than Emerson's. His willingness to actually live according to principles rather than just write about them created a contrast that highlighted Emerson's own compromises. For Thoreau, living with the Emersons provided stability and intellectual stimulation. He had access to books he couldn't afford, conversations with visiting intellectuals, time to read and write, but he was also essentially a handyman in someone else's house. The tension between his intellectual ambitions and his practical circumstances was becoming sharper. Then on New Year's Day, 1842, everything changed. John Jr. was shaving. The razor slipped, a tiny cut on his finger. Nothing really. Except this was before antibiotics, before understanding of infection. The cut became infected. Within days, John's finger turned black. The infection spread. Lockjaw set in. Tetanus is a horrible way to die. Your muscles contract uncontrollably. Your jaw locks shut. You're conscious as your body destroys itself. John Jr. died on January 11th, 1842, in Henry's arms. He was 27 years old. Henry's reaction was extreme even by the standards of grief. He developed psychosomatic symptoms of lockjaw himself. For days he exhibited the same symptoms that had killed his brother, though there was no physical cause. His body was manifesting trauma that his mind couldn't process. He recovered physically within a week, but something fundamental had broken. John Jr. had been his closest friend, his business partner, his companion in the world. They'd run the school together. They'd loved the same woman. They'd shared a vision of how education could work differently. Now Henry was alone with that vision, alone with the question of what to do with a life that suddenly felt desperately finite. His brother had died from a shaving accident. Random, meaningless. If that's how fragile existence was, what were you supposed to do with the time you had? Thoreau spent the next 3 years wrestling with that question. He continued living with the Emersons. He did odd jobs. He worked in his father's pencil factory, where he actually made significant improvements to the production process by researching German techniques. Thoreau family pencils became known as the best in America, largely because of Henry's technical innovations. He also started writing seriously. Essays, observations about nature, thoughts about how people lived. The journal he'd started at Harvard became a daily practice, a place where he worked out ideas that would eventually become published work. But he was restless. The life he was living didn't match the life he was thinking about. He was writing about authentic existence while doing yard work for someone else, thinking about simplicity while embedded in a comfortable household. The contradiction was becoming unbearable. By early 1845, he knew something had to change. He needed to test his ideas against reality. Not just think about how to live deliberately, but actually try it. The question was how, where, what form that experiment would take. And that's when he remembered a conversation from his Harvard days. A classmate had once built a small hut by a pond, a place to read and think away from distractions. The idea had seemed interesting at the time. Now it felt like a solution. Emerson owned land near Walden Pond, about 2 miles south of Concord. Thoreau asked if he could build a cabin there. Emerson agreed. In spring 1845, Thoreau began planning the experiment that would define him. He was 28 years old. His brother had been dead 3 years. The woman he loved had married someone else. His career was a series of false starts and compromises. He was going to build a cabin in the woods and figure out how to live. He started building on July 4th, 1845, Independence Day. The symbolism was almost too obvious, but Thoreau wasn't subtle about this kind of thing. He was declaring independence from the life everyone expected him to live. The cabin went up fast. Thoreau knew carpentry from working on houses during college breaks, practical skills that Harvard didn't teach, but that turned out to matter more than Greek conjugations. He bought the boards from a shanty owned by James Collins, an Irish labourer who'd worked on the railroad. $8 for the materials. He salvaged what he could, reused everything possible. The structure was simple. 10 feet by 15 feet. One room, a door, 2 windows, a fireplace he'd add later. The whole thing cost him $28 and 12.5 cents. He kept meticulous records of every expense because the point wasn't just to live cheaply. It was to prove exactly how cheaply you could live if you stopped pretending you needed things you didn't. People called it an experiment. Thoreau hated that word. Experiments happened in laboratories, controlled environments where you manipulated variables. This wasn't that. This was just trying to live honestly instead of playing along with society's elaborate charade about what constituted a necessary life. The location mattered. Walden Pond was close enough to Concord that he could walk to town in half an hour. Far enough that he couldn't hear the church bells or the train whistle unless the wind was right. The pond itself was a glacial kettle, formed 10,000 years ago when a massive ice block melted and left a depression that filled with water, nearly 2 miles around, deep enough in the centre that locals claimed it was bottomless, though Thoreau would eventually measure it at exactly 102 feet. The woods around it were second growth, recovering from being cleared for farmland decades earlier. White pine, oak, pitch pine. Not wilderness by any real definition, but wild enough, quiet enough, empty enough that he could think without the constant interruption of other people's expectations. He moved in before the cabin was finished, slept on the floor while he built the bed, cooked over an outdoor fire while he constructed the chimney. The incompleteness was part of it. You didn't need perfection to start living. You just needed enough. What did he do all day? Walked, wrote, worked his bean field, read, thought. The routine sounds monotonous described like that, but monotony was the point. Remove the chaos and you discover what's actually there underneath. Mornings he'd work the beans, 2.5 acres he'd planted in early June, before the cabin was done. He'd cleared the land himself, turning over soil that hadn't been cultivated in 15 years. The beans were practical, food and a cash crop, but they were also philosophical. You put seeds in the ground, you pulled weeds, you watched things grow. The process couldn't be rushed or outsourced or optimized beyond a certain point. It operated on its own timeline. He'd work until the sun got too hot, then retreat to the cabin to write. The journal was daily now, thousands of words tracking everything he noticed, the colour of the pond at different times of day, which birds arrived when, how ice formed and melted, what people said when they visited, his own thoughts about economy, about time, about what constituted wealth. Afternoons were for reading. He'd brought his books from Emerson's house. Homer in Greek, the Bhagavad Gita, Confucius. He read slowly, the same way he walked, paying attention to everything. A page an hour sometimes. Not because the material was difficult, but because he refused to consume it like fuel. Books weren't something you got through. They were something you inhabited. Evenings he'd walk around the pond or into town, or just sit watching the water. He became obsessed with the pond's moods, the way it changed colour with the light and the season and the weather. Sometimes green, sometimes blue, sometimes reflecting the sky so perfectly you couldn't tell where water ended and air began. The solitude wasn't absolute. That's another myth about Walden. Thoreau wasn't a hermit. He had visitors constantly. Emerson walked out regularly. Other Concord intellectuals made the trip. Farmers stopped by. Runaway slaves passed through using the cabin as a station on the Underground Railroad. His mother and sisters visited every week, usually bringing food he claimed not to need but accepted anyway. He also went to town frequently, borrowed books from the library, attended lectures, had dinner with friends. The cabin was 2 miles from his parents' house. He'd walk there, eat his mother's cooking, walk back. This happened more often than the mythology suggests. The point wasn't isolation, it was autonomy. The difference matters. Isolation is running away from society. Autonomy is choosing when and how you engage with it. What was he learning? That most of what people called necessity was actually habit. That you could live richly on almost nothing if you redefined richness to mean time instead of possessions. That the natural world operated according to patterns you only noticed if you paid attention, and that those patterns revealed something about how to live. He calculated everything. 6 weeks of work per year could meet all his material needs. The rest of the time was his, 46 weeks of freedom purchased with 6 weeks of labour. Compare that to how most people lived, working 50 weeks to pay for things they didn't need and didn't have time to enjoy because they were working. The math was simple, but radical. If you eliminated unnecessary expenses, you eliminated the need for the labour that paid for them, which meant you reclaimed the time that labour consumed. Time was the real currency. Everything else was just a medium of exchange. His neighbours thought he was wasting his life. A Harvard graduate, living in a shack, growing beans, going nowhere. What kind of career was that? What kind of future? They were measuring success by the wrong metrics. Accumulation, status, progress up some imaginary ladder. Thoreau was measuring it by freedom, by the ability to spend his days doing what he considered worthwhile instead of what someone else valued. The writing happened in notebooks first, observations and ideas that would eventually become Walden, but he was also working on something else, a book about the trip he'd taken with his brother John 5 years earlier, before John died. A week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers, travelling by boat through Massachusetts and New Hampshire in September 1839. That manuscript was an act of mourning disguised as a travel narrative. Every description of the landscape was haunted by John's absence. Every philosophical digression was really about loss and time, and the impossibility of holding on to anything. He'd been working on it for 3 years, using it to process grief he couldn't express directly. The cabin gave him space to finish it, away from well-meaning friends who wanted him to move on, away from the house where John had died, away from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost except the words he was trying to shape into meaning. Winter came. People asked how he'd survive. Would he freeze, starve, give up and slink back to civilization? They were disappointed when he did fine. The cabin stayed warm enough with the fireplace. Food was adequate. The pond froze solid. Ice thick enough to walk on. He'd measure its depth at different points, drill holes to study how ice formed from the top down, document everything with the precision of a scientist and the attention of a poet. January was the hardest month, not because of the cold, but because of the isolation. The visitors stopped coming. The days were short. The landscape was monochromatic. This was when the experiment felt most real, when comfort and habit couldn't sustain you, and you had to actually believe in what you were doing. He read the Bhagavad Gita that winter, sitting by the fire while ice expanded on the pond outside. The Hindu text spoke about duty and action and the self's relationship to the world. Different words than Emerson used, but pointing toward the same ideas, that the material world was less real than it appeared, that consciousness was the primary reality, that you could live in society without being of it. Thoreau was trying to work out a practical philosophy, not just an intellectual one. Ideas that didn't change how you lived were just decoration. He wanted to know what actually worked, what you could build a life on that wouldn't collapse when tested. Spring arrived like a resurrection. Ice melted, the pond opened, birds returned, everything dead came back to life. Thoreau planted his beans again, extending the field slightly, refining his technique. The second year was easier than the first because he knew what to expect. The novelty was gone, but the purpose remained. What he was discovering, he'd later write, was that he'd gone to the woods to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, to see if he could learn what it had to teach and not discover, when he came to die, that he had not lived. That last phrase was the key. The fear wasn't death. The fear was reaching the end and realizing you'd spent your entire existence doing what you were supposed to do instead of what you actually wanted. That you traded the only non-renewable resource, time, for things that didn't matter. That you died without ever really living. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was survival instruction for people drowning in lives they'd somehow agreed to without meaning to. Thoreau was testing whether there was another way, whether you could step off the treadmill and discover it kept running without you, whether you needed it at all. July 1846. He'd been at the pond for a year. One afternoon he walked to town to pick up a shoe from the cobbler. Simple errand. But on the way he ran into Sam Staples, the local constable and tax collector. Staples asked if Thoreau had paid his poll tax. Thoreau said no, he hadn't, and he wasn't planning to. The tax supported the Mexican-American War and the institution of slavery. Thoreau opposed both. He wouldn't fund them. This wasn't a spontaneous protest. Thoreau had been refusing to pay the tax for years. Usually Staples just ignored it, but this time, for whatever reason, he decided to enforce the law. He arrested Thoreau and took him to jail. The Concord jail was a small brick building. Thoreau spent the night in a cell with a man accused of burning down a barn. They talked about their situations. Thoreau found his cellmate more honest than most people he knew in polite society. The next morning, someone, probably his Aunt Maria, paid the tax. Thoreau was released. He was furious, not about being jailed, about being freed. He'd wanted to make a point about civil disobedience, about the right and duty to refuse cooperation with injustice. Having someone pay on his behalf undermined the whole thing. He went back to Walden Pond, angry and energized. The experience would become an essay, eventually published as Civil Disobedience, that would influence Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and every non-violent resistance movement that followed. But that was later. In the moment, it was just one night in jail and a philosophical question about what you owed to a government acting immorally. The second year at Walden continued. More beans, more writing, more observation. But something was shifting. The experiment had proven what it needed to prove. He knew now that you could live on almost nothing. That simplicity was possible. That nature operated according to patterns you could learn. That time mattered more than money. The question was what came next. You couldn't stay at Walden Pond forever. Or you could, but then it would stop being an experiment and become just another routine. The point wasn't to escape society permanently. It was to understand it clearly enough that you could engage with it on your own terms. In September 1847, after 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, Thoreau left Walden Pond. Emerson had asked him to watch his house, while Emerson travelled to Europe to lecture. Thoreau agreed. He packed his books, closed up the cabin, and walked back to Concord. People assumed he'd failed, couldn't hack it in the woods, had to return to civilization. They were missing the point entirely. He hadn't been hiding from the world. He'd been studying how to live in it. Now it was time to apply what he'd learned. Slightly paraphrased from Putnam.org, back at the Emerson house, Thoreau settled into a familiar rhythm. He managed the household, did repairs, tended the garden. Emerson was in England giving lectures, building his reputation as America's leading intellectual. Thoreau was fixing doors and organizing bookshelves. The arrangement looked subservient from the outside. Thoreau as Emerson's handyman, his assistant, his lesser companion. People in Concord saw it that way. Emerson's wife Lydia knew better. She recognized Thoreau's intelligence, his independence of thought, but she also noticed something else. He was restless. The Walden experiment had changed him in ways that made ordinary life feel constraining. He worked on his manuscript, the book about his time at the pond. He'd been drafting it during those 2 years, filling journals with observations about seasons and ice and the economics of bean farming. Now he needed to shape it into something publishable. The problem was finding time between household duties and his actual paid work, because Thoreau needed money. The Walden experiment had proven you could live cheaply, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem of capitalism. You still needed some income. He worked at his father's pencil factory, applying his knowledge of chemistry to improve the graphite mixture. Thoreau pencils became among the best in America, largely because of Henry's innovations. He also did surveying. Turned out his Harvard education in mathematics had practical applications. Concord landowners needed property lines established, boundaries marked, acreage calculated. Thoreau was precise and reliable. He charged fair rates and delivered accurate work. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. The surveying took him outdoors, which he preferred to factory work. He walked Concord's fields and forests with his instruments, measuring and mapping. He noticed everything: which trees grew where, how water flowed, where animals made their paths. The surveying became another form of natural observation, just with trigonometry involved. His journal entries from this period show someone trying to reconcile different parts of himself. The philosopher who wanted to think about ultimate questions. The naturalist who wanted to catalogue every plant and bird. The writer who wanted to shape language into art. The citizen who wanted to respond to political injustice. The son who needed to help support his family. Most people compartmentalize these roles. Thoreau wanted them unified. He wanted work that was also study, that was also spiritual practice, that was also service to something larger than himself. This wasn't idealism exactly, more like stubbornness, a refusal to accept that life had to be divided into what you wanted to do and what you had to do. In January 1848, he gave a lecture at the Concord Lyceum. The topic was the rights and duties of the individual in relation to government. This was his jail experience formalized into philosophy. He'd spent almost 2 years thinking about what it meant to refuse cooperation with injustice. The lecture argued that individual conscience superseded government authority, that you couldn't delegate moral responsibility to elected officials or majority vote, that when government acted immorally, you had not just the right, but the duty to resist, that this resistance should be non-violent, but absolute. The Concord audience listened politely. Some agreed, some disagreed, most were indifferent. It was just another lecture at the Lyceum, the weekly entertainment for educated New Englanders. Thoreau revised the text and tried to get it published. It finally appeared in 1849 in a short-lived magazine called Aesthetic Papers, under the title Resistance to Civil Government. Almost nobody read it. Meanwhile, he kept working on the Walden manuscript. The problem was structure. He had hundreds of pages of observations, anecdotes, philosophical reflections. How do you organize that into a coherent book? He tried chronological order, following the seasons. He tried thematic chapters, grouping similar ideas. Nothing quite worked. The other problem was tone. Walden was angry and serene, practical and mystical, humorous and deadly serious. It criticized society while acknowledging Thoreau's dependence on it. It praised solitude while describing constant visitors. It claimed to offer a blueprint for simple living while admitting most people couldn't or wouldn't follow it. These contradictions weren't bugs, they were features. Thoreau wasn't writing a how-to manual. He was trying to capture the complexity of actually trying to live deliberately. The gap between philosophy and practice. The tension between withdrawal and engagement. But publishers wanted something simpler. A nature book or a philosophy book or a social critique. Pick one. Thoreau couldn't. The whole point was that these things were inseparable. How you lived was what you believed. Your daily choices were your real philosophy. In 1849, he published his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. It was about a boat trip he'd taken with his brother John back in 1839, before John's death. The book mixed travel narrative with essays on poetry, friendship, Christianity, and whatever else interested Thoreau. He paid for publication himself, a risky move. The publisher printed 1,000 copies. Over the next 4 years, they sold fewer than 300. Thoreau ended up with a debt of $290 and a house full of unsold books. He joked about it later. "I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself." The failure stung. Not just financially. It suggested that maybe nobody wanted what he was offering. Maybe his particular combination of nature observation and philosophical reflection and social criticism didn't have an audience. Maybe he should stick to surveying and pencil making. But he kept working on Walden, revising, restructuring, refining. He went through 7 complete drafts over 8 years. Each version got tighter, more focused, more deliberately crafted. The casual reader thinks Thoreau just wrote down what happened at the pond. Actually, every sentence was polished until it achieved the effect he wanted. During these years, his relationship with Emerson changed. They'd been mentor and student, older established writer and younger aspirant. Now Thoreau was developing his own voice, his own philosophy. He was moving away from pure transcendentalism towards something more grounded in physical reality, in ecology, in the specific details of natural processes. Emerson noticed. He still valued Thoreau, but also felt frustrated by him. Why wasn't Henry more ambitious? Why did he refuse opportunities to lecture widely, to build a reputation, to become a public intellectual? Why did he insist on staying in Concord, doing manual labor, when he could be in Boston or New York, making a name for himself? Thoreau's answer was that he'd already found what he was looking for, not success or fame or influence, understanding, direct contact with reality, unmediated by ambition or social expectation. Why would he trade that for a lecture circuit? The disagreement was fundamental. Emerson believed in progress, in reform, in using ideas to change society. Thoreau believed in resistance, in refusal, in living your principles regardless of society's response. Emerson wanted to improve the world. Thoreau wanted to live in it honestly. Their friendship didn't break, but it cooled. They still saw each other, still talked, but the easy intimacy was gone. Emerson was disappointed in Thoreau's lack of conventional achievement. Thoreau was disappointed in Emerson's conventional ambitions. In 1850, Thoreau's father died. This meant Henry had to take over the pencil business, at least partially. More of his time went to manufacturing and sales, less to writing and walking. He resented it, but did it. Family duty wasn't something you could transcend through philosophy. His mother, Cynthia, became more demanding. She'd always been the forceful one in the family, the one who insisted Henry go to Harvard, the one who ran the boarding house and managed the finances. With John Sr. gone, she relied on Henry more. He lived at home, contributed to household expenses, helped with her various projects. It wasn't the life he'd imagined. But whose life matches their imagination? That was part of what Walden was about. The gap between what we think we want and what we actually do. The compromises we make, the obligations we accept, the ways we negotiate between ideals and reality. He still walked, every day, usually for 4 hours. This was non-negotiable. His real work, he said, was observing nature. Everything else, the surveying and pencil making and household repairs, that was just how he funded the real work. His journals from the 1850s fill thousands of pages, detailed observations of plant succession, animal behaviour, seasonal patterns. He was developing what we'd now call ecological awareness, understanding how systems interrelate, how energy flows through ecosystems, how communities of organisms create and maintain environments. Nobody cared. This wasn't science in the professional sense. Thoreau had no laboratory, no institutional affiliation, no credentials. He was an amateur naturalist in an era when that was becoming suspect. Real science was moving towards specialization, quantification, controlled experiments. Thoreau was just walking around writing down what he noticed. But what he noticed mattered. He tracked ice-out dates on Walden Pond for years, creating a record that modern climate scientists now use. He documented plant phenology, when different species leafed out and bloomed, data that shows how climate has changed over 170 years. He described forest succession processes that academic ecologists wouldn't formalize for another century. His surveying work gave him a detailed map of Concord in his mind. He knew every swamp and hillside, every stream and woodlot. He could tell you which fields had been cleared when, which forests were regrowing after logging, how human activity shaped the landscape. This knowledge was both practical and philosophical, understanding how humans and nature interacted, how we changed the land, and it changed us. In 1851, he began a project that would occupy him for the rest of his life, a comprehensive natural history of Concord. He wanted to document everything, every plant species, every bird, every mammal, insect, fish, their behaviours, their ranges, their seasonal patterns. It was an impossible task, but he pursued it systematically. This was Thoreau the scientist, often overlooked in favour of Thoreau the philosopher or Thoreau the political radical. He developed methods for careful observation. He learned to distinguish between what he actually saw and what he assumed. He recognised his own biases and tried to account for them. He understood that perception was selective, that you saw what you expected to see unless you trained yourself otherwise. The training involved patience, sitting still for hours watching a bird's nest or an ant colony, returning to the same spot repeatedly to track changes, taking measurements, making sketches, recording data. This wasn't romantic communing with nature. It was work. Hard, meticulous, often tedious work. But it produced insights. Thoreau started noticing patterns that weren't in the natural history books. How certain plants always grew together. How bird migration timing correlated with food availability. How forest composition changed in predictable sequences. He was seeing ecology before the field had a name. His other project was Walden, still revising, still not published. Publishers had rejected it multiple times. Too strange, too angry, too hard to categorise. Thoreau kept working on it anyway. By 1852, he'd completed a 6th draft. The structure was finally right. 18 chapters following a year at the pond, but compressed and rearranged to create thematic unity. The book opened with Economy, a long analysis of how people spend their lives and what they get in return. It was part autobiography, part social criticism, part practical advice. Thoreau detailed his expenses at Walden down to the cent, then asked what the reader was spending their life on, not just money. Time, energy, attention. Later chapters covered different aspects of the experiment. Sounds described what you heard when you stopped talking. Solitude explained why being alone wasn't lonely. Visitors catalogued the people who came to the cabin. The bean field detailed agricultural economics and the pleasure of honest work. Higher laws wrestled with the tension between wild instinct and civilized morality. The final chapters tracked the seasons. Housewarming described preparing for winter. Former inhabitants told the history of people who'd lived near the pond before. Winter animals catalogued who remained active in the cold. The pond in winter explored ice and its meanings. Spring celebrated renewal. The book ended with conclusion, which wasn't really a conclusion, more like a challenge. If you've read this far, Thoreau said, don't just admire it, do something. Not necessarily move to the woods. That wasn't the point. The point was to live deliberately, to examine your assumptions, to resist the momentum of conventional life, to wake up. In 1854, after 8 years of revision, Walden was finally published. The first printing was 2,000 copies. It sold slowly but steadily. Reviews were mixed. Some praised its originality and moral force. Others found it arrogant and impractical. Most readers didn't know what to make of it. Thoreau didn't care much about reviews. He'd written the book he needed to write. Whether it found an audience was secondary. The real question was whether he could live according to his own principles, and that was a daily struggle with no final answer. The slavery question wouldn't leave him alone. Every day the contradictions pressed harder. Massachusetts claimed to be free soil, but the state enforced federal fugitive slave laws. Concord residents considered themselves progressive, but they bought products made by enslaved labor. Thoreau's neighbors opposed slavery in principle while participating in the system that sustained it. He started refusing to pay his poll tax in 1842. The tax wasn't large, just $1 or $2, but it supported a government that protected slavery and was prosecuting an unjust war against Mexico to expand slave territory. Paying it meant consent. Thoreau wouldn't consent. For 4 years, nobody bothered him about it. Small-town tax collection was informal. If someone didn't pay, the collector might ask politely, then forget about it. But in July 1846, Sam Staples, the Concord constable, found Thoreau in town and couldn't overlook it anymore. He arrested him. Thoreau spent one night in jail. Someone, probably his Aunt Maria, paid the tax the next morning without asking him. He was released. The whole thing should have been minor. Instead, it became one of the most influential acts of civil disobedience in history. What happened in that jail cell? We don't know exactly. Thoreau wrote later that he felt freer in jail than his neighbours were outside it. They were imprisoned by conformity, by the need to maintain respectability, by their unwillingness to challenge authority. He'd broken free of those chains by refusing to participate. The night in jail crystallised something he'd been thinking about for years: the relationship between individual conscience and state power. The question of when obedience becomes complicity. The possibility that refusing to cooperate with injustice might accomplish more than political action within the system. 2 years later, he gave a lecture at the Concord Lyceum about it. On the relation of the individual to the state laid out his argument. The government was a machine. Sometimes machines malfunction. When they do, you don't just complain about the product. You throw a wrench in the gears. If the machine requires you to be an agent of injustice, refuse. Don't wait for the majority to agree with you. Don't trust the political process to fix itself. Act according to your conscience immediately, even if you're alone, even if it costs you. The essay got published in 1849 as Resistance to Civil Government. It didn't make much impact at first. Thoreau's reputation was still mainly local. But the ideas were there, waiting to be discovered by people who needed them. Meanwhile, he was making money the only way that didn't compromise his principles. Surveying. Concord was growing. Property lines needed to be established, lots divided, roads planned. It required mathematical skill, physical stamina, and meticulous attention to detail. Thoreau was good at it. He bought professional equipment, a compass, a chain for measuring distances, stakes and markers. He learned the technical aspects quickly. The work suited him. It got him outside, walking property lines through woods and fields. It paid decently, without demanding he sell his time completely. The surveying also fed his natural history observations. He saw the land in detail, understood drainage patterns and soil types, noticed which plants grew where. Every job became a field study, but it was still work for hire. He was trading time for money, same as everyone else, just at a better rate and with more freedom. The tension between needing income and wanting to live deliberately never resolved. He reduced his expenses as much as possible, but couldn't eliminate them entirely. His journal kept growing. By 1850, he was filling multiple volumes per year. The entries weren't diary-like anymore. They were detailed observations of natural phenomena, philosophical reflections, fragments of essays. The journal became his real work, the surveying just a way to fund it. He walked constantly, not for exercise but for observation. He developed regular routes around Concord, checking specific spots at different times of day and year. He tracked when flowers bloomed, when birds arrived and departed, when ice formed and melted. He was creating a phenological record before the discipline existed. People thought it was odd. What was the point of knowing when the shadbush bloomed or which direction geese flew. Thoreau couldn't always articulate the point, but he knew it mattered. Understanding nature's patterns meant understanding how systems worked. Modern ecology would eventually prove him right, but in 1850, it just seemed eccentric. His relationship with Emerson had changed. They were still friendly, but no longer close. The initial mentor-student dynamic had shifted. Thoreau had developed his own voice, his own ideas. He disagreed with Emerson about politics, about how to engage with social issues, about what writing should do. Emerson believed in influence through culture, in changing minds through essays and lectures. Thoreau thought direct action mattered more. Emerson cultivated respectability and used it as a platform. Thoreau rejected respectability as a trap. The differences created distance. They still saw each other, still had conversations, but something had cooled. Emerson's journal entries about Thoreau became more critical. He admired his friend's gifts, but worried he wasn't using them productively. Why waste time measuring trees when he could be writing great works? Thoreau didn't see it as waste. The measuring was the work. Understanding required direct contact, sustained attention, data collection. You couldn't understand a forest from your study. You had to be in it, repeatedly, patiently. In 1851, something shifted in his work. The journal entries became more confident, more focused. He knew what he was doing now, recording the complete natural history of Concord. Every species, every seasonal change, every ecological relationship. It would take decades. He'd need to develop better methods, collect more data, refine his observations, but he had the outline of a massive project. This was science, though he didn't call it that. He distrusted academic science, its distance from actual phenomena, its tendency to classify without understanding. But his own work was rigorous. He made hypotheses, tested them, revised his thinking based on evidence. He noticed things professional naturalists missed because they didn't spend enough time watching. Migration patterns, feeding behaviours, subtle habitat preferences. His journals filled with observations that wouldn't be confirmed by scientific studies for 100 years. But there was no career in this work. No institution wanted an observer without credentials or publications. He was doing original research without funding, recognition, or scientific community. Just him and his journals and the woods around Concord. The anti-slavery movement was intensifying. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it federal law to return escaped slaves. Even in Massachusetts, even in Concord, you could be arrested for helping someone flee bondage. The government demanded active participation in slavery's enforcement. Thoreau helped anyway. He wasn't an organizer like his mother, who ran the local female anti-slavery society. He didn't give speeches or write pamphlets, but when fugitives needed shelter or transportation, he provided it. The Underground Railroad ran through Concord, and Thoreau was part of the network. This was criminal activity. If caught, he could be fined or jailed. He didn't care. The law was wrong. Conscience superseded legislation. He'd written about this in theory, now he lived it. In 1854, Anthony Burns, an escaped slave, was captured in Boston. Federal marshals held him, while his former owner came from Virginia to claim him. The case became a test. Would Massachusetts resist or comply? Thousands protested. There were attempts to free Burns by force. The government sent soldiers to prevent a rescue. In the end, Burns was marched through Boston streets, surrounded by armed guards, and shipped back to slavery. It cost the federal government $100,000 to return one man to bondage. Thoreau was furious. He gave a speech in Framingham on July 4th, the same day Walden was published. While others celebrated independence, he mourned the betrayal. Massachusetts had collaborated in kidnapping. The state had sold its principles for federal approval. The speech was harsh, angrier than his usual style. He compared the government to a savage beast. He suggested the Constitution wasn't worth preserving if it protected slavery. He said he couldn't recognize his country anymore. This was the context for Walden's publication, not a pastoral retreat, but a political act. The book appeared the same week as his anti-slavery speech. Both were responses to the same problem. How do you live ethically in an unethical society? Walden wasn't an escape plan. It was a method for maintaining integrity. If you reduced your needs, you reduced your dependence on corrupt systems. If you examined your life carefully, you saw where compromise happened. If you practiced deliberate living, you created space for resistance. The first reviews were mixed. Some praised the writing, others found it arrogant. Many didn't know what to make of it. Was it autobiography? Philosophy? Nature writing? Social criticism? It was all of those and none of them completely. Sales were slow. The first printing of 2,000 copies took 5 years to sell. Publishers didn't reprint it. For years, Walden was essentially out of print. Thoreau received barely any money from it. He didn't seem disappointed. He'd written what he needed to write. The book existed. Whether it found readers immediately, or later, or never, wasn't really up to him. His focus remained on the journal and field observations. By 1855, he was tracking hundreds of species, recording thousands of data points annually. The journals were approaching 2 million words. Nobody would read them in his lifetime. He wrote them anyway. He took trips to explore different ecosystems. Cape Cod 3 times, studying barrier beaches and ocean ecology. Maine woods repeatedly, learning about northern forests. Canada once, though, that trip was less successful. Each journey produced essays, though most weren't published until after his death. The Cape Cod essays showed a different Thoreau than the Walden persona. Darker, more interested in death and disaster. He visited shipwreck sites, examined bodies washed ashore, contemplated the ocean's indifference. The writing was beautiful and disturbing. The main essays explored wilderness and what it meant. Not the managed woodland around Concord, but actual wild forest. He hired Indian guides, learned their names for plants and places, tried to understand their relationship with the land. His respect for their knowledge was genuine, though his understanding remained limited by his own cultural assumptions. These excursion pieces didn't fit anywhere easily. Too long for magazines, too fragmentary for books. He published some sections, but much remained in manuscript form, waiting for someone to collect and edit them. In 1857, he met John Brown. The meeting happened in Concord. Brown was traveling through Massachusetts, raising money and support for his anti-slavery activities in Kansas. Someone arranged for him to speak at the town hall. Thoreau attended and was impressed. Here was someone who didn't just talk about opposing slavery. He acted. He'd fought in Kansas, defended Free State settlers, confronted pro-slavery forces directly. He was willing to use violence if necessary. Most abolitionists were pacifists. They believed in moral suasion, in changing hearts through argument. Brown believed in making slavery too expensive to maintain. If enslavers faced armed resistance, the system would collapse. Thoreau found this logic compelling. He'd written about throwing wrenches in machines. Brown was doing it literally. The violence troubled Thoreau, but the conviction and courage didn't. They talked several times during Brown's visit. Brown stayed with family friends. Thoreau invited him to survey a piece of land, using the pretext of work to spend more time with him. They discussed strategy, tactics, the limits of non-violent resistance. 2 years later, Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, attempting to seize a federal arsenal and spark a slave uprising. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. Northern opinion mostly condemned him. Even abolitionists distanced themselves. Brown's violence seemed counterproductive, his plan foolish. The raid had killed people and accomplished nothing. Thoreau saw it differently. Brown had acted on his principles completely. He'd risked everything for justice. The raid failed militarily, but succeeded morally. It forced the country to confront the violence inherent in slavery. When Concord scheduled a memorial service for Brown, Thoreau demanded to speak. The organisers were reluctant. They wanted a moderate tone. Thoreau wasn't moderate. He spoke anyway, delivering one of the most radical speeches of his life. He compared Brown to Christ, praised his willingness to die for principle, said Brown was worth more than all the politicians in America combined, called him the most American of Americans because he'd actually fought for the ideals the country claimed to hold. The speech shocked people. This was treasonous talk, defending a convicted criminal who tried to incite insurrection. Thoreau didn't care. He'd found someone who embodied complete moral commitment, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The speech marked a shift. Thoreau, the nature observer, the philosophical hermit, was also Thoreau the radical, willing to defend political violence if it opposed slavery. Both personas were genuine. Both were necessary for the complete picture. The Brown speech revealed something that had been building for years. Thoreau wasn't just observing society from a distance. He was becoming more willing to confront it directly, to take sides, to accept conflict as necessary. This shift showed up in his writing too. The later journal entries were angrier, more political. He couldn't ignore what was happening. The country was tearing itself apart over slavery, and neutrality felt like cowardice. But even as he engaged more with politics, he never stopped his other work. The natural history observations continued, the measuring, recording, cataloguing. He was trying to understand ecological patterns, how species interacted, how seasons affected behaviour. He noticed things no one else bothered looking for, the precise dates when certain flowers bloomed, which birds arrived first in spring, how ice formed on the pond, where it started, how it spread. He filled notebooks with data that seemed pointless to most people. What was he building toward? He didn't always know. The observations accumulated without clear purpose, but he trusted that patterns would emerge if he gathered enough information. That nature had logic you could discover through patient attention. By 1860, his health was failing. He'd always been prone to respiratory problems, probably tuberculosis that had been dormant for years. In December, he went out in a rainstorm to count tree rings, got soaked, developed bronchitis that wouldn't clear. His lungs had been damaged already. This pushed them past recovery. He started coughing constantly, losing weight, growing weaker. The doctors said warmer climate might help. So in May 1861, he travelled to Minnesota with a young companion, Horace Mann Jr. The trip was supposed to be therapeutic, get away from Massachusetts winter, breathe different air. But it was also one last chance to see the frontier, to witness landscapes he'd only read about. He was too sick to enjoy much of it, spent most of the time indoors, writing letters, trying to conserve energy. They reached Minnesota, stayed a few weeks, but his condition didn't improve. He came back home worse than when he'd left. The Civil War had started while he was gone. Fort Sumter fell in April. By the time Thoreau returned to Concord in July, the country was mobilizing for what everyone assumed would be a short conflict. No one knew it would last 4 years and kill 600,000 people. Thoreau followed the war news closely. He'd been right about slavery requiring force to end. Lincoln hadn't wanted war, had tried compromise, but the South seceded anyway, and now violence was the only option left. Brown's raid looked less crazy in retrospect. Someone had to start the confrontation. As his health declined, Thoreau focused on finishing what he could. He revised essays, prepared manuscripts for publication, tried to organize the massive journal into usable form. There was too much material, decades of observations. He couldn't possibly shape it all before dying. His sister Sophia helped. She'd always been supportive, understood his work better than most family members. She transcribed pages, helped edit, managed correspondence when he was too weak to write. Without her, more would have been lost. Emerson visited regularly. Their relationship had been strained for years, the old intimacy gone. But facing Thoreau's death brought them closer again. Emerson read to him, brought news from town, sat quietly when talking was too exhausting. What did they talk about? We don't know specifics. Emerson's journal entries from this period are cryptic, emotional without being detailed. He knew he was losing someone important, someone who challenged him, pushed his thinking in directions he wouldn't have gone alone. Thoreau's last writings are fragmentary, notes, observations, attempts to capture ideas that wouldn't fully develop. Some of it's incoherent, the tuberculosis affecting his mind as his body failed, but even dying, he kept trying to articulate what he'd learned. One theme kept recurring: wildness. Not wilderness as a place, but wildness as a quality, the untamed element in nature, in humans, in thought. Civilization tried to suppress it, make everything orderly and controlled, but wildness kept breaking through. It was necessary, life-giving. Without it, everything became dead and mechanical. He wrote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." Not wilderness, but wildness. The distinction mattered to him. You could have wildness in a city if you maintained the right spirit, and you could have wilderness that was spiritually dead if approached with the wrong attitude. This idea connected everything: his politics, his natural history, his philosophy. Slavery was wrong because it destroyed human wildness, reduced people to property. Industrial capitalism was wrong because it destroyed natural wildness, turned forests into lumber. Conformity was wrong because it destroyed individual wildness, made everyone think alike. The alternative was staying alert, independent, willing to dissent. Maintaining your own wildness, even when society demanded compliance. This wasn't about being contrarian for its own sake. It was about preserving something essential that civilization constantly threatened. By early 1862, Thoreau was bedridden. He could barely speak, couldn't walk, spent his days propped up with pillows trying to breathe. Visitors came to say goodbye. Some expected deathbed conversions, final religious declarations. Thoreau disappointed them. When his aunt asked if he'd made his peace with God, he replied, "I did not know we had ever quarrelled." When someone asked if he could see the other shore, he said, "One world at a time." He wasn't interested in conventional piety. Even dying, he remained himself. His last words were reportedly, "Moose and Indian." No one knows what he meant. Maybe he was remembering Maine, maybe hallucinating, maybe trying to describe something he was seeing. The words are ambiguous enough to support any interpretation. He died on May 6, 1862, at 9 a.m. He was 44 years old. His funeral was held in the Unitarian Church, the same building where he'd heard lectures as a child. Emerson delivered the eulogy. The eulogy was complicated. Emerson praised Thoreau's character, his dedication, his unique vision. But he also expressed disappointment that Thoreau hadn't accomplished more, hadn't become the leader and teacher Emerson thought he could have been. Instead, he'd remained an observer, a recorder, someone who never quite fulfilled his potential. This judgment reveals more about Emerson than Thoreau. Emerson wanted disciples, followers who'd spread transcendentalist ideas. Thoreau refused that role. He went his own direction, developed his own thinking, wouldn't subordinate his work to anyone else's agenda. Emerson found this frustrating. The funeral was well attended. Concord residents came, some who'd known Thoreau all his life, others who barely understood what he'd been doing. The town appreciated him more after his death than during his life. That's a common pattern, but it still stings. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, the family plot. His grave was simple, marked with a small stone. Later, people who valued his work erected larger monuments, but the original marker was unpretentious, which suited him. What happened to his writings? Most were still unpublished. Walden had sold poorly. A week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers had been a financial disaster. The essays had appeared in magazines, but weren't collected. The journal was enormous and unorganized. Sophia and Emerson became his literary executors. They started sorting through the manuscripts, deciding what could be published. This was difficult work. Thoreau's handwriting was terrible, his notes often cryptic, his organisational system idiosyncratic. They published The Maine Woods in 1864, Cape Cod in 1865, A Yankee in Canada in 1866. These were cobbled together from magazine pieces and manuscript fragments. They're uneven, clearly unfinished, but they contain brilliant passages. The journal presented bigger problems. It ran to millions of words, most of it unpublishable in its raw form. Emerson selected passages for an 1863 collection called Excursions, but the bulk remained in manuscript for decades. Thoreau's reputation grew slowly. Walden found readers gradually, especially in England, where it was republished in the 1880s. The nature writing attracted one audience, the political writing another. Different groups claimed him for different purposes. Environmentalists saw him as a prophet of conservation, someone who'd understood ecological thinking before the word existed. Anarchists claimed him as a political radical who challenged state authority. Individualists valued his defense of nonconformity. Each reading emphasized different aspects of his work. The complexity made him hard to categorize. He didn't fit neatly into any tradition. Not quite a transcendentalist, not quite a naturalist, not quite a political activist. He was all of these, and none completely. The ambiguity frustrated scholars who wanted clear classifications. His influence on later writers was enormous but often unacknowledged. The nature essay as a genre owes much to his example. The tradition of political dissent through civil disobedience traces directly to his work. The idea of voluntary simplicity as spiritual practice comes from Walden, but for decades, most of this influence was indirect, filtered through other writers who'd absorbed his ideas without necessarily crediting him. He was more cited than read, more mythologized than understood. The full journal wasn't published until 1906 in a 14-volume edition. This revealed the scope of his observations, the systematic quality of his natural history work. Scientists started recognizing that he documented ecological patterns with remarkable precision. His phenological records, tracking seasonal changes over years, provided baseline data that became increasingly valuable as climate change accelerated. By the mid-20th century, his reputation was secure. Walden became required reading in schools. The essay on civil disobedience influenced Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Environmentalists claimed him as a founder of their movement. He'd become canonical, which meant he was both more widely read and more thoroughly misunderstood than ever. The misunderstandings took predictable forms. People read him as a hermit who hated society, when he'd actually been quite social and engaged with his community. They imagined him as a primitive living off the land, when he'd been deliberate and philosophical about his time at Walden. They treated him as a nature mystic, ignoring his scientific precision and political radicalism. Part of the problem was Walden itself. The book's literary success overshadowed everything else. People read it as autobiography, as self-help, as nature writing, but rarely as the philosophical text Thoreau intended. The other works remained less known, creating a distorted picture of his overall project. What was that project? After spending years reading his journal, his letters, his published and unpublished work, a pattern emerges. He was trying to develop a method for living deliberately, for paying attention, for staying awake in a world that encouraged sleepwalking. The natural history observations were part of this. By noticing small changes, seasonal patterns, ecological relationships, you trained yourself to see what others missed. The attention itself mattered, regardless of what scientific knowledge it produced. The political radicalism was part of it too. Resisting unjust laws, refusing complicity with evil systems, this required the same alertness. You had to notice what society normalized, question what everyone accepted, maintain independence of thought, even when it isolated you. The writing was how he processed all this. The journal entries, the essays, the lectures, these weren't just recording observations, they were attempts to understand, to find patterns, to articulate principles that might help others develop their own methods. He never finished the work. There was always more to observe, more to question, more to articulate. Death interrupted the process, leaving manuscripts, fragments, unfinished ideas scattered across notebooks. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the point wasn't to complete a system, but to demonstrate a practice, show how someone might live deliberately, pay attention, resist injustice, stay wild even in civilization. The incompleteness leaves room for others to continue, to adapt the approach to their own circumstances. That's what his readers have done, across more than 150 years, found different things in his work, emphasized different aspects, applied his ideas to situations he never imagined. The texts remain open enough to support this variety of interpretation, which raises an uncomfortable question about how we actually engage with historical figures. We claim to learn from them while actively resisting what they try to teach. We domesticate their radicalism, file down their sharp edges, turn revolutionaries into inspirational poster quotes. Thoreau wrote that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. That line gets quoted endlessly, usually in contexts that would have appalled him. Self-help books use it. Corporate motivational speakers deploy it. It appears on coffee mugs and wall art, stripped of its original meaning, reduced to vague encouragement to pursue your dreams. But read the surrounding passage. He's talking about economic slavery, about how people mortgage their lives to accumulate possessions they don't need, about conformity that destroys the soul. He's not offering gentle inspiration. He's delivering a diagnosis of social disease. The same thing happened with civil disobedience. The concept got absorbed into mainstream political discourse, sanitized, made safe. People invoke it without understanding what Thoreau actually advocated. He didn't propose symbolic protest that respects existing power structures. He argued for direct refusal to participate in evil systems, regardless of consequences. When he went to jail for refusing to pay taxes that supported slavery and the Mexican War, he wasn't making a gesture. He was withdrawing cooperation from injustice. The night in jail wasn't the point. The refusal was the point. He would have stayed in jail indefinitely rather than compromise. His essay explaining this got renamed. Originally titled Resistance to Civil Government, it became Civil Disobedience only after his death. The new title softened the message. Resistance sounds confrontational. Disobedience sounds almost polite, like a child refusing vegetables. The editing wasn't accidental. Gandhi read Thoreau in South Africa and recognized something the comfortable interpreters missed: the radical core, the willingness to accept suffering rather than participate in oppression. Martin Luther King Jr. saw it too. The civil rights movement understood that Thoreau wasn't proposing negotiation within existing systems. He was proposing withdrawal from those systems entirely until they reformed. Both men ended up in jail repeatedly. Both faced violence. Both knew that genuine resistance cost something. They weren't reading Thoreau as a nature mystic or a literary figure. They were reading him as a manual for confronting power. This creates tension with the environmental movement's appropriation of his legacy. Not that environmentalists are wrong to claim him. His observations of nature, his insistence on wildness as essential to human health, his documentation of ecological relationships, all of this legitimately founded modern environmental thinking. But they often skip the political dimensions. Thoreau didn't just want people to appreciate nature, he wanted them to resist the economic systems destroying it. The railroad cutting through Walden Woods wasn't just an aesthetic problem. It represented industrial capitalism's assault on both nature and human freedom. He saw these as connected. You couldn't preserve wilderness while participating in an economy that demanded its destruction. You couldn't live deliberately while following social patterns designed to keep you productive and compliant. The personal and political were inseparable. His actual politics were more radical than most modern readers realize. He didn't just oppose slavery abstractly. He helped fugitive slaves escape, violating the Fugitive Slave Act, risking legal consequences. When John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry, trying to start a slave rebellion, most abolitionists condemned the violence. Thoreau defended Brown publicly, repeatedly, calling him a hero and martyr. This wasn't naive idealism. Thoreau understood that Brown's raid failed militarily. He defended it anyway because he believed some evils required direct action, not endless debate. He was done waiting for slavery to end peacefully through legislative process. His speeches defending Brown were among his most radical work, and they cost him friends and reputation. The transcendentalist circle mostly backed away. Even Emerson, while privately sympathetic, kept a public distance. Thoreau stood alone, insisting that Brown's willingness to die for human freedom made him morally superior to all the politicians and preachers who tolerated slavery through inaction. Reading those speeches now, you can feel him burning with rage at comfortable people who valued order over justice, who preferred slow reform to disruptive action, who wanted enslaved people to wait patiently for their liberation. He had no patience for patience, not when people were suffering. This dimension of his thought makes contemporary readers uncomfortable. We prefer the Thoreau who walked in the woods, who noticed birds and seasons, who wrote beautifully about simplicity. That version doesn't challenge our complicity in ongoing injustices. That version lets us feel inspired without being disturbed. But he wanted to disturb. The whole point of Walden wasn't to say, "Isn't nature lovely?" It was to demonstrate that you could step outside the economic machine, that you didn't have to participate in systems you found morally repugnant, that deliberate living required saying no to most of what society demanded. He calculated that he could support himself by working 6 weeks per year. The other 46 weeks were his own. This wasn't laziness, it was a refusal to trade life for money beyond what survival required. Every hour spent earning unnecessary income was an hour stolen from thinking, observing, writing, living. Modern readers often miss that this was a political statement, not just personal preference. He was arguing against the entire structure of industrial capitalism, against the notion that humans exist primarily as economic units, against the conversion of time into money as the fundamental measure of value. His experiment at Walden was partly about proving this alternative possible. Look, he said, you can actually do this. You can opt out. You can build a house for $28 and change. You can grow beans. You can have time to think. The machinery of commerce and industry doesn't own you unless you let it. The response then and now has been to treat this as impractical idealism. Sure, nice if you can afford it. Nice if you have Emerson as a friend who owns land. Nice if you're young and healthy and educated. But what about real people with real responsibilities? Thoreau anticipated this objection. That's why the economy chapter in Walden runs through detailed calculations, showing exactly what he spent and earned. He wasn't claiming everyone should replicate his specific choices. He was demonstrating that the supposedly necessary expenses people accepted without question weren't actually necessary. He was questioning the baseline assumptions. Do you need a bigger house? Do you need fashionable clothes? Do you need the possessions everyone says you need? Or are these things you've been taught to want? Mechanisms for keeping you trapped in economic dependence? The questions remain relevant. How much of what we buy is genuinely necessary versus socially required? How much of our working life goes toward maintaining appearances, status, the lifestyle we're supposed to want? What would we do with our time if we didn't have to earn money for things we don't actually need? Thoreau's economics were deliberately provocative. He wanted readers to examine their own lives, to question why they worked so hard for things that didn't make them happier or freer. He was attacking the fundamental logic of capitalism, the endless cycle of work and consumption that he saw destroying both nature and human potential. This is why his work remains controversial. Not the parts about nature. Everyone's comfortable with beautiful descriptions of Walden Pond. But the economic critique, the political radicalism, the insistence that individuals have both right and duty to resist unjust systems, these elements still provoke resistance, particularly from people who benefit from existing arrangements. Thoreau's philosophy threatens anyone invested in the status quo. If he's right that you can live simply and freely, that you don't need what society insists you need, then entire industries lose their justification. If he's right that participation in unjust systems makes you complicit in injustice, then comfortable people have to confront uncomfortable questions. So we domesticate him. We turn him into a nature writer, a literary figure, an inspirational quote dispenser. We extract the parts that don't threaten us and ignore the rest. We build museums celebrating his legacy while carefully avoiding what he actually believed and taught. His friends did this too. After his death, they edited his work, softened his radicalism, emphasized the poetry over the politics. Emerson's eulogy praised Thoreau's naturalist observations while barely mentioning his political activism. The first published collection of his work left out his most radical essays. This pattern continued through generations of editing and interpretation. Each new edition, each new biography, each academic analysis had to decide what to emphasize, what to minimize, how to present him to contemporary readers. The choices weren't neutral, they shaped how we understand his legacy. By the early 20th century, he'd been transformed into a genteel nature mystic, safely distant from political controversy. The radical who defended John Brown became the hermit who liked birds. The man who went to jail rather than pay taxes became the writer who appreciated sunsets. The transformation was nearly complete. Then something unexpected happened. New social movements rediscovered his actual work. Not the sanitized versions, but the original texts. They found someone useful, someone whose ideas applied directly to their struggles. Civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, environmental activists, all recognized Thoreau as an ally. This created tension with the literary establishment that had claimed him. Suddenly he wasn't just a nature writer to be analysed in academic papers. He was a political thinker being deployed in contemporary struggles. The attempt to make him safe had failed, because the work itself resisted domestication. You can edit it, contextualize it, explain it away, but the fundamental challenge remains. The questions he asked don't have comfortable answers. The practices he advocated require sacrifice. The life he demonstrated remains difficult and unsettling. That's probably why he endures. Not because everyone agrees with him or successfully applies his principles, but because he identified tensions that persist, questions that don't resolve, problems that each generation has to confront again in their own context. How should you live? What do you owe to society versus yourself? When does participation in normal life become complicity in injustice? How much of what you think you need is actually necessary? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical problems that shape daily choices. Thoreau didn't provide final answers. He provided a method, an approach, a demonstration of what happens when you take these questions seriously enough to let them change how you live. The method remains available, waiting for anyone willing to apply it. The current application of that method reveals something unexpected. We're not applying Thoreau's principles. We're applying carefully curated versions of them, stripped of their most challenging elements. The market has absorbed him, commodified him, turned his rejection of commodification into a product you can buy. You can purchase minimalist lifestyle guides inspired by Walden. You can attend workshops on simple living that cost hundreds of dollars. You can follow influencers who document their intentional lifestyles through carefully filtered photographs. The irony would probably amuse Thoreau or enrage him. Hard to say which. This isn't entirely cynical. Some people genuinely try to apply his ideas, make real changes, accept actual sacrifices. But the cultural machinery around Thoreau now serves a different function. It allows people to feel aligned with his values without actually disrupting their lives in ways that would matter. Reading Walden becomes an act of self-improvement rather than social critique. The focus shifts inward, personal rather than political. You're encouraged to examine your own relationship with materialism, your own consumption habits, your own spiritual state. All valuable, but not what Thoreau was primarily concerned with. He was making a political argument. The personal experiments demonstrated the argument's viability, but the argument itself was about social organization, about justice, about what we owe each other and what systems we're willing to support through our participation. That political dimension gets lost when we turn him into a life coach. His critique of economic systems becomes advice about budgeting. His analysis of how society shapes consciousness becomes tips for mindfulness. His call for resistance to injustice becomes suggestions for personal authenticity. The transformation isn't accidental. Political Thoreau is dangerous. Self-help Thoreau is marketable. One threatens power structures. The other reinforces them by suggesting that problems are individual rather than systemic, that solutions lie in personal choices rather than collective action. This creates a strange situation where Thoreau's popularity actually diminishes his impact. More people know his name now than ever before. Fewer people understand what he actually argued for. He's become famous for a version of himself that he would barely recognize. The environmental movement claims him, and rightfully so. His observations of nature, his attention to ecological relationships, his insistence that wilderness has value beyond human utility, all this prefigured modern environmentalism. But even here, the appropriation is selective. Contemporary environmentalism often focuses on conservation, on preserving nature as separate from human life. Thoreau's vision was more integrated. He wasn't trying to save nature from people. He was trying to show people how to live as part of nature, how to recognize their dependence on and connection to ecological systems. That's a more radical proposition. It requires reimagining human society entirely, not just setting aside protected areas. It challenges the urban industrial model that most environmentalists accept as inevitable. Thoreau didn't accept it. He offered an alternative, demonstrated its viability, argued for its superiority. Most environmental discourse now operates within the framework he rejected. We debate carbon offsets and emission standards and sustainable development, all premised on the continuation of the basic system. We're negotiating terms rather than questioning foundations. Thoreau questioned foundations. That's what made him radical then, and what makes him difficult now. The questions don't resolve. They keep demanding answers that most people don't want to give. His influence on social justice movements is better documented and harder to domesticate. Gandhi and King both acknowledged his impact explicitly. They read Civil Disobedience and found a template for resistance that worked. Not just theoretically, but practically. This wasn't abstract philosophy for them. It was operational guidance. How do you resist unjust laws? You refuse to obey them. How do you challenge unjust systems? You withdraw cooperation. How do you maintain moral authority while breaking laws? You accept the penalties without violence. Gandhi applied this in South Africa and India, developing it into a comprehensive strategy that eventually helped end colonial rule. King applied it in America, using non-violent resistance to challenge segregation and discrimination. Both credited Thoreau explicitly. That lineage is real and significant. It shows Thoreau's ideas working at scale, producing actual political change. Not just individual awakening, but social transformation. The method proved durable across different contexts and cultures. But notice what both Gandhi and King had to do. They had to organise, build movements, create institutions. Thoreau's individual witness became collective action. His personal refusal became mass resistance. The principles scaled, but they required infrastructure he never built or advocated for. This points to a real limitation in Thoreau's approach. Individual resistance is important, but it's not sufficient for large-scale change. You need coordination, strategy, sustained pressure. Thoreau demonstrated the moral foundation, but others had to construct the organizational framework. His relevance today depends partly on whether you think individual witness still matters. In an age of mass politics and institutional power, does one person's refusal to participate make any difference? Can personal integrity accomplish anything when systems are so vast and impersonal? Thoreau would say, yes, that you have to start with individual conscience, that collective action only works when individuals decide to act. The system's power depends on participation. Withdrawal of consent, even by one person, is meaningful. But the counter-argument is strong. Individual action without coordination is just performance. It makes the individual feel righteous without threatening the system. Real change requires organised movements with clear demands and sustained pressure. Both positions have merit. The tension between them remains unresolved. Thoreau's example suggests that individual integrity matters, that you can't build just systems from unjust participation. But the historical record shows that individual integrity alone rarely produces structural change. What survives from Thoreau, then, isn't a complete political program. It's a sensibility, an orientation, a set of questions you can't escape once you've encountered them. How much of what you do supports systems you oppose? Where's the line between prudent participation and complicit acceptance? What would it actually cost to live according to your stated values? These questions don't have comfortable answers. That's probably why we avoid them by turning Thoreau into something safer, something that doesn't demand as much. His death at 44 cut short whatever further development his thinking might have taken. The tuberculosis that killed him had been present since his Harvard days, a constant background threat that finally overwhelmed his body's resistance. He spent his final months editing his work, trying to prepare as much as possible for publication. Those last months were productive, despite the physical decline. He continued writing in his journal almost until the end. The entries from that period show no self-pity, no crisis of faith. He observed his own dying with the same attention he'd given to everything else. When someone asked if he'd made his peace with God, he replied that he wasn't aware they'd quarrelled. It's a good line, probably apocryphal, but it captures something real about his approach to death. He didn't need reconciliation because he'd never felt separation. His last words were reportedly moose and Indian, which scholars have spent considerable time trying to interpret. Were they random, the disordered output of a failing brain? Or were they significant, a final return to the wilderness that had shaped his thinking? We don't know. Like most things about Thoreau, we're left with fragments, pieces that don't quite form a complete picture. The gaps are as revealing as what we can see. The journal entries stop. The body was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, eventually moved to Author's Ridge, where he rests near Emerson, Hawthorne, and the Alcotts. The location is appropriate and ironic. He's part of the literary establishment now, whether he would have wanted that or not. What he left behind was substantial, despite the short life. The journal alone runs to 2 million words, a daily practice maintained for 24 years. The published works, though fewer than he'd hoped, include some of the most influential texts in American literature and political philosophy. But the real legacy isn't the word count or the published volumes. It's the example of a life lived deliberately, a sustained attempt to make actions match convictions. That example remains available, waiting to be encountered by each new generation that discovers his work, and people keep discovering it. Walden has never been out of print since its publication in 1854. It's been translated into dozens of languages. New editions appear regularly, each with fresh introductions trying to explain Thoreau to contemporary readers. The explaining is necessary because he's genuinely strange, hard to categorize, resistant to easy interpretation. He doesn't fit neatly into progressive or conservative frameworks. He challenges assumptions held across the political spectrum. That's probably why he endures. Each era finds different things in Thoreau because he contains contradictions that can't be resolved. He was a hermit who received visitors daily, an individualist who depended on community, a nature mystic who improved pencil manufacturing techniques, a political radical who never organized a movement, a writer who claimed to dislike writing. These contradictions aren't flaws in his thinking. They're features, reflections of the complexity he was trying to capture. Life doesn't resolve into simple principles. Any philosophy that pretends otherwise is lying. Thoreau didn't lie. He showed what he saw, described what he experienced, argued for what he believed. He got things wrong, changed his mind, contradicted himself. The honesty is part of the legacy. That honesty is what survives the attempts to domesticate him. You can market simplified versions, extract convenient quotes, turn him into whatever you need him to be. But the actual texts resist. They keep asserting uncomfortable truths, asking difficult questions, demanding more than most people want to give. The demand doesn't diminish with time. If anything, it intensifies as the systems he criticized become more pervasive, more total in their reach. The questions he asked about how to live in an unjust society, how to maintain integrity while participating in compromised systems, how to know what you actually need versus what you've been taught to want. These questions are more urgent now than they were in his time. That urgency guarantees his continued relevance. Not because he provided answers, but because he demonstrated a method for approaching the questions. Look closely, think carefully, test assumptions, question what everyone accepts. Live according to what you discover rather than what you're told. The method works. It's uncomfortable, demanding, sometimes isolating, but it works. You can apply it now, today, in whatever circumstances you face. The specific details differ, but the underlying approach remains valid. That's what we're left with after stripping away the mythology and the marketing. A method, a demonstration, an example of someone who took ideas seriously enough to let them reshape his life. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. Thoreau showed that it's possible to live differently, to question what seems inevitable, to find freedom within constraints. He proved that individual witness matters, that personal integrity has value, that you can refuse participation in systems you oppose. He also showed what that refusal costs: comfort, security, social acceptance, conventional success. He paid those costs and considered them worthwhile. Whether others agree depends on what they value, what they're willing to sacrifice, what kind of life they want to lead. The choice remains open. Thoreau's example demonstrates one possibility, not the only one, but a genuine one that worked for him and might work for others willing to attempt it. The cabin is gone. The pond remains. The questions persist, waiting for anyone ready to take them seriously. He's been dead for over 160 years. The cabin he built lasted barely a decade after he left it, torn down for scrap lumber. The bean field is forest again. Walden Pond is surrounded by visitors now, people who come looking for something, though most couldn't tell you what. What survives isn't the physical evidence, it's the irritation, the persistent discomfort of his questions. You can ignore them for a while, distract yourself with the usual routines, but they keep surfacing. How much of your life is actually yours? How much of what you think you need was decided by someone else? When does participation become complicity? These aren't rhetorical. Thoreau meant them as practical inquiries requiring actual answers. He provided his answers by building a cabin and growing beans and going to jail and defending John Brown. Your answers will look different because your circumstances are different, but the questions remain the same. The culture industry has spent 160 years trying to neutralize him, turn him into a safe figure, suitable for school curriculums and coffee mugs. Put him on t-shirts with inspirational quotes about marching to the beat of a different drummer. Make him about personal authenticity and finding yourself and living your best life. Strip away everything that made him dangerous. It hasn't worked, not completely, because the texts are still there, available to anyone willing to read past the edited highlights. Civil disobedience still argues that you have a duty to resist unjust laws. Walden still demonstrates that you can opt out of economic systems that don't serve you. The journal still records 24 years of sustained attention to what most people ignore. The method he developed, the practice of deliberate living, isn't historical. It's not something that worked in 1850s Massachusetts, but has no current application. If anything, it's more relevant now when the systems are larger, more pervasive, harder to see clearly, or resist effectively. Look at what occupies your attention. How much of it is chosen versus algorithmically delivered? How much of your time goes to work that feels meaningful versus work that just pays bills? How many of your desires are genuinely yours versus manufactured by people selling solutions to problems they created? Thoreau would recognize these patterns instantly. The specific technologies differ, but the underlying logic is identical. Convince people they need things they don't. Keep them working to pay for those things. Ensure they're too busy and exhausted to question the arrangement. Repeat until death. The alternative he proposed wasn't complex. Reduce your actual needs. This frees time currently spent earning money for unnecessary expenses. Use that time for whatever you consider worthwhile. Reading, thinking, observing, creating, building something, helping someone, whatever. The point isn't what you do with the time. The point is having it. This sounds simple until you try implementing it. Then you discover how many obstacles exist. Social expectations, family obligations, debt structures, healthcare costs, housing markets. The system has evolved to make opting out progressively more difficult. Thoreau could build a cabin for $28. Try that now. But difficulty isn't impossibility. The specifics of how you reduce dependence on corrupt systems will differ from Thoreau's approach. The principle remains valid. Every need you eliminate is a small liberation. Every hour you reclaim is yours again. The process compounds. His political legacy is clearer and harder to evade. Gandhi and King proved that civil disobedience works at scale when properly organized. Non-violent resistance to injustice has succeeded in contexts Thoreau never imagined. The method he articulated in response to one night in jail became a template for dismantling colonialism and segregation. That success creates its own problems. The technique has been studied, analysed, incorporated into political science curricula. Governments now have playbooks for handling civil disobedience, strategies for neutralising it without obvious violence. The element of surprise is gone, which means the method has to evolve. Thoreau provided principles, not a fixed blueprint. Refuse cooperation with injustice. Accept consequences without violence. Maintain moral clarity while breaking unjust laws. How you apply these principles in your context requires creativity and courage he can't supply. From 1862. The environmental dimension of his legacy is the most contested. Everyone from radical ecologists to corporate sustainability officers claims him. He's been deployed to support wilderness preservation, urban gardening, voluntary simplicity, deep ecology, sustainable development, and conflicting visions of what human relationship with nature should be. The actual text supports some of these readings better than others. Thoreau wasn't primarily interested in preserving wilderness as separate from human activity. He wanted humans to recognize themselves as part of nature, to understand their dependence on ecological systems, to see that destroying nature meant destroying themselves. That's a more radical proposition than setting aside national parks. It requires reimagining civilization entirely. Not just protecting certain areas while continuing business as usual everywhere else, fundamentally changing how humans relate to the rest of the living world. Most environmental policy operates within frameworks Thoreau rejected. We're negotiating terms of exploitation rather than questioning whether exploitation should continue. We're debating which technologies might reduce harm rather than examining whether the harm is necessary. We're trying to sustain the unsustainable. His answer would be that you can't reform fundamentally extractive systems. You have to replace them with something else entirely. What that something else looks like is the question we still haven't answered. Thoreau demonstrated one possibility at Walden Pond. Others will look different, but avoiding the question doesn't make it disappear. What makes Thoreau continuously relevant isn't that he solved these problems. He didn't. He demonstrated that you could confront them honestly, that you could try living according to principles most people only endorse abstractly. The demonstration wasn't perfect. He contradicted himself, failed to fully apply his own standards, remained dependent on systems he criticized. But he tried, genuinely, persistently, for his entire adult life. That effort matters more than perfect consistency. It shows the attempt is possible, that you can organize your life around questions of meaning and justice, rather than just accepting whatever default existence society offers. The journal entries from his final months show someone still trying, still observing, still thinking. No dramatic revelations or deathbed conversions. Just the same attention he'd been practicing for 24 years, applied now to his own dissolution. He approached death the way he'd approached everything else, with curiosity, precision, and minimal sentimentality. That's probably the most useful thing he left us. Not answers, not a system, not a completed philosophy, a demonstrated practice of sustained attention and questioning. The practice doesn't require agreeing with all his conclusions. It requires taking the question seriously enough to develop your own answers through lived experience rather than theory. You won't build a cabin at Walden Pond. That specific experiment can't be repeated, but the principle behind it remains available. Find what's essential, eliminate what isn't, use the freed resources for whatever you consider worthwhile. Test your assumptions against reality. Adjust based on what you learn. The practice doesn't guarantee success or happiness or enlightenment. It guarantees difficulty. Thoreau's life was harder than it needed to be because he insisted on living according to principles that made everything more complicated. He could have had a normal career, conventional success, comfortable conformity. He chose otherwise and paid the costs. Whether those costs were worthwhile depends on what you value. Security or freedom, comfort or integrity, acceptance or authenticity. These aren't absolute choices. Everyone negotiates some compromise. The question is whether you're making conscious choices or just following the path of least resistance. Thoreau insisted on conscious choice. That insistence cost him conventional measures of success but provided something else: freedom to spend his time as he wished, space to think deeply about questions that mattered to him. The satisfaction of knowing his actions matched his stated beliefs, imperfectly but genuinely. The legacy isn't a set of conclusions but an ongoing provocation. His questions don't have expiration dates. They keep demanding answers from each generation that encounters them. The answers change, but the questions persist because they are addressing something fundamental about how humans organize collective life and individual existence. Every system that privileges efficiency over meaning, growth over sustainability, profit over justice, creates the conditions that make Thoreau relevant again. Every person who feels trapped by obligations they never consciously accepted, by needs they don't remember choosing, by work that consumes their life without producing satisfaction, is potential audience for what he was trying to demonstrate. The demonstration remains accessible. You can read Walden now today for free from multiple sources. You can read Civil Disobedience and the Journal and everything else. The texts are available. What you do with them is your choice. Thoreau can't make that choice for you. He can only show what he did, what he learned, what it cost him. The example exists as possibility, not prescription. You'll have to figure out your own version, because your circumstances differ from his. But the underlying questions remain identical. How should you live? What do you actually need? When does participation in normal life become complicity in injustice? How much of what occupies your attention genuinely matters? What would you do with your time if you didn't have to spend it earning money for things you don't need? These questions don't resolve. You don't answer them once and move on. You answer them repeatedly through daily choices that either align with what you believe or contradict it. The gap between stated values and actual behaviour is where Thoreau's work becomes most uncomfortable and most useful. He showed that you could close that gap, not completely, but substantially. That you could build a life organised around questions of meaning rather than just economic necessity. That individual integrity was possible even in systems designed to make it difficult. That you could say no and survive the consequences. The saying no is what survives all attempts to domesticate his legacy. You can market him, mythologise him, turn him into a literary figure safely distant from contemporary struggles. But the fundamental gesture of refusal remains. Thoreau went to jail rather than pay taxes supporting slavery. That refusal cost him one night of sleep. It also demonstrated something that can't be edited out or explained away. The power to refuse exists. The system depends on participation. Withdrawal of consent, even by one person, even in small ways, matters. Not because it immediately changes the system, but because it proves that alternative choices are possible, that what seems inevitable is actually just what most people accept. Thoreau proved you could not accept it, could question what everyone took for granted, could live according to different principles, could prioritize time over money, meaning over security, integrity over success. The proof exists in the life he lived and the texts he left. What you do with that proof is yours to decide. You can ignore it, find it impractical, conclude that times have changed too much for his example to remain relevant. Or you can recognize that the questions he identified haven't changed at all, that the tensions between individual conscience and social pressure, between what you need and what you're told to want, between participation and complicity, these remain as urgent now as they were in 1850. His method for confronting those tensions is still available. Look closely, think carefully, question assumptions, test beliefs against lived experience, adjust based on what you learn, refuse participation in what you can't justify, accept consequences without violence, maintain integrity even when it costs you.